So we can understand that people like Jefferson and Madison could not have done what they did if they did not hold hundreds of people in slavery to create the wealth that gave them the leisure to have the education and the time to think the deep thoughts and to achieve. They were brilliant men who read deeply and widely, really in the entire history of human knowledge, and did very important critical things. But they wouldn't have been able to do it if they were not supported by the institution of slavery.
Welcome to Empowering Leadership, a podcast from Dorrier Underwood. Join us as we explore new perspectives on leadership and discover what it takes to be effective as a leader. Here's your host, Doug McVadon.
Welcome to Empowering Leadership, and the guest on our podcast today is Elizabeth Chu. And I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to Elizabeth that I don't normally do, which is to read some of your qualifications. So Elizabeth, you're the Senior Director of Museum Programs and Chief Curator for Montpelier, which is the historic home of President James Madison and a lot more, right?
That's right.
Well, so thank you for joining us today. And before we engage in the conversation about all that other stuff that it represents besides a home, I want to tell people that you're not only an art historian, you have a BA from Yale, a master's from University of London, a PhD from Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, and you worked at a lot of museums and historic sites for the past 30 years, right? More than 30 years. And at Montpelier, I know you've overseen a lot of important projects. Mostly the thing you're known for is the creation of the exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color, which is the winner of 6 national awards. And you were the curator of that. Can you just tell us what that represents before I move on with other parts of your resume? Sure,
but I have to emphasize that I in no way did that myself.
I got it. Yes, that's right.
Amazing team. So Montpelier is unique among presidential homes and plantation sites in that for almost 30 years, we have collaborated and partnered with the descendants of people who were held in slavery at Montpelier. And they have been advisors and partners and colleagues in interpreting the stories of their ancestors. So the exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color, is really the first major exhibition about slavery, really anywhere, where we're presenting the stories of enslaved people through the faces, voices, and family histories of descendants.
Yeah, and it's not just the faces of slavery, it's the faces of these specific people who worked at James Madison's house for their entire lives, and generation after generation built that into what it remains today, which is really a stunning example of that type of operation, because it's not just a home, it's a major economic unit, right?
Yes, it was a plantation. There was the way that James Madison's family, 3 generations of it, created wealth through the labor of people they held in slavery, which enabled Madison to have an extremely good education and to have the time to be a deep thinker and political theorist and to really conceive the major ideas of the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, that takes somebody doing the work of cooking and cleaning and caring for the livestock and harvesting and building and repairing so that he could sit upstairs in that famous room that people have visited if you've gone on the Montpelier home tour, where he conceived the ideas that became the United States Constitution.
That's right.
And it's my understanding that a number of the people working there understood that connection in some way, that they were enabling his contribution in some way.
Well, we use the term invisible founders to suggest really the critical contributions that enslaved people made to this country, to its founding, its development, its success, its economy. This country would not, we wouldn't be sitting here right now unless tobacco cultivation with the labor of enslaved people in Virginia in the later part of the 17th century hadn't been so incredibly successful.
Yeah, if it hadn't been something that created wealth,
Mm-hmm.
it would not have continued to be a going concern, as they say, right?
That is correct.
Before you came to Montpelier, you worked at the other famous presidential house in Virginia, Monticello, for 13 years. And I know you were instrumental there in expanding the interpretation of the site to include women and slavery and domestic work. Tell us a little bit about that exhibition, To Try All Things.
Sure. Well, once again, I in no way did any of this just by myself.
Got it.
You know, the history of presidential plantations, estates, homes has been touring the house and talking about the president, his career, his life, you know, his development intellectually, whatever he achieved in the presidency. But obviously, these places were a whole lot more. And now, because the people who owned them and lived in them were famous and important, they survive. We have the ability and the opportunity to use them to talk about everybody who lived in the earlier years of our country, in the colonial era and the founding era and the early republic. So we can understand that people like Jefferson and Madison could not have done what they did if they did not hold hundreds of people in slavery to create the wealth that gave them the leisure to have the education and the time to think the deep thoughts and to achieve the things that they achieved. I mean, you know, to do the reading, the deep reading and scholarship that it took for Jefferson and Madison both to read the great ideas of the Enlightenment that in the English-speaking world were really mostly developed in Scottish universities, and to, you know, read the writings of, for example, John Locke, who wrote ideas like liberty is a natural human right, or a government should be an agreement or a contract between those being governed and those doing the governing. And turning those ideas into, first of all, a declaration of independence from what they saw as a tyrannical British government, but then also creating a new country. How are they going to create a new country? And they were brilliant men who read deeply and widely, really, in the entire history of human knowledge, and did very important critical things. But they wouldn't have been able to do it if they were not supported by the institution of slavery.
Well, tell me about that coming into the forefront of the thinking of art historians and historians in general, because I know, and I'll reveal my age in this story, back in the 70s when I was a teenager, I impressed my girlfriend at the time by taking her to Monticello, you know, which was a classier date than most of the kids in high school could conceive. And I was going for myself as much as her, you know, but it was exactly what you said, a kind of pristine white experience of what the people who lived in the house thought about, what they ate, how they dressed, what they did, and everything else was in the background. It's like, oh yeah, and they had workers, servants, I think they were even called, you know, servants. And then meanwhile, yes, the servants would be in the kitchen, you know, which certainly didn't sound very sinister. Right. You know, it sounded like they probably had signed up to be servants in the big fancy kitchen, you know, or something like that. So that was the Doug McVadon at 15 getting exposed to a presidential home, and what it represented for me did not confront me with any of what we now would say is the full history, the complete history of what was really happening at those plantations, and what, to your point, enabled the breakthrough thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. So you are neither the first nor the last boyfriend to take your date to Monticello. The first 3 times that I went there, I went with boyfriends.
There you go. There you go.
So good plan, Doug. Yes. So the expansion of narratives at historic sites
Mm.
really, well, the beginning of it goes back, I would say, to the early 1990s, but it builds on academic history going back maybe 20 years prior to that, where historians were turning to wanting to understand regular people and, how people worked and how, things were organized and what women did and what people of color did and, understanding slavery. And it took a while for this to kind of trickle down to historic sites.
So that was a movement in history to move away from just the kings and the generals and to talk about the common person.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right. And so when you look deeply at American history, you cannot ignore the fact of what these plantations were. And there's been incredibly brilliant scholarship on the institution of slavery for the last, 35, 40 years. It's really transformed our understanding of how this country came to be. What is fascinating to me, though, so we call what we do whole truth history, where we talk about the incredibly important achievements of James Madison throughout his public life, from the time he became involved in Virginia politics right after the Declaration of Independence until he died after spending 8 years as president and 8 years before that as Secretary of State. We take nothing away from him. He is incredibly important. He was a brilliant political theorist. We would not be sitting here without him. And he was a lifelong slaveholder who never freed a single person. And by talking about the whole story, all we're doing is talking about the whole story. We're not trying to knock him off a pedestal. We're not trying to tear him down. We're not trying to forget about him, get rid of him. We are simply making the story complete.
So you're not replacing a story. That's what you're claiming, is that you're not replacing something or altering something. You called it expansion.
We are expanding the narrative, exactly, to include the stories of all the people whose efforts made things happen.
Now, you've gotten quite a bit of pushback by people who take this as exactly what I just finished saying it's not, which is an erasure or altering or what would you say, replacing the story. Like, we're not going to tell that anymore. Instead, we're going to have it be all about that he was a slaveholder. And that's going to be the only thing people need to know anymore about James Madison is he never freed the slaves. Did you hear that? So you're saying yes, that is part of what you're going to say, but that doesn't replace what you said about we wouldn't have a country today without him.
That's absolutely right. We talk about Madison's achievements and successes and critically important contributions all day long, every day. And I think what happens for some people, you and I are probably in the tail end of this, but, for many decades, American history was taught as this triumphant story of these, rebellious colonists getting it over on the British Empire. And then these brilliant guys in wigs and, stockings making a new country. And of course, that story's true, but it's only part of it. Yeah. And a lot of people who were educated in that, what I'm going to call kind of the era of American exceptionalism,
yes,
they feel that their world is rocked to the core, to have slavery kind of come in the picture. And it's very hard for people to widen out the aperture and see all of it. And so one thing I've learned from being in this field for over 30 years is that you have to meet people where they are, or they can't hear you. And if they can't hear you, they can't change the way they think. So, it's very important that people really understand that we're not trying to do anything to get rid of Madison in any way.
Well, it's interesting. I've got people in my own family who can talk extensively about European history and be very critical of the British Empire and the English kings, while saying that they were great and they did all these wonderful things that never would have happened. And it's obvious why England was leading the world, because their standard of living and their way of thinking. Meanwhile, they were absolute savages and, committed genocide right there in Scotland and Ireland. And we can say that about them. It's okay to say that about them, but it's not okay to say that about us. It's not okay to say that we got America. Of course, we have the United States because we're so good at genocide. You can't say that. I guess I just did, but it's like that's not a popular statement. But you could say that the whole conquering of this continent was based on that.
100%. And human beings are extremely complicated. We're extremely contradictory. We do not, walk in a straight line on a linear path. We do a lot of different things. We can be incredibly evil and bad, and we can be incredibly brilliant and change the world for the better. We can, literally commit genocide, and we can lead the world in, conquering diseases.
Right.
And those things,
and ending famines and things like that. And those things
have to, but we have to be able to hold at the same time in our minds those conflicting realities. People have a really hard time holding together in their mind conflicting narratives. And what we want to do is try to help people be able to do that, because that is what makes whole truth history.
Well, it's really the paradox of being alive, that all these songs about it's a thin line between love and hate. We don't have to look any farther than our own personal relationships to see the truth of what you just said about people being complicated and having just as much evil as good, as certainly as a possibility, what they can produce. Well, so that sounds like that's a hard-won realization by you, having worked both at the place that celebrates Jefferson and then now the place that celebrates Madison, neither of whom freed any slaves, and both of whom are elevated to the highest levels of, they represent human liberty and democracy and freedom to most people. Isn't that contradictory? Isn't that paradoxical?
Yes, it is. And I should say Jefferson did free 9 people.
Oh, got it.
During his lifetime and a few in his will, but he owned over 300 in the course of his life.
So 9. He freed 9, and okay, good. That's interesting right there. That he actually knew that he could and did, but then didn't.
Right.
What he must have freed Sally's children.
They were all members of the Hemmings family. Yes. So what we're asking people to do is difficult, and older people who were educated, as I said, the American exceptionalist narrative, have a hard time. Younger people, I have found, are much more likely to be okay with it and understand and even expect to hear it. But we also hear a lot of older people say, I never learned this in school. Oh my goodness, I can't believe this. Thank you for showing us this. We did not know this. We did not learn this in school. We hear that even more than we hear the pushback. Interesting.
Well, let me ask you about another aspect of your career that doesn't involve a presidential home. You were the director of the Curatorial and Education Division at Ranolda House, closer to where I am in North Carolina, up in Winston-Salem. And that was all post-slavery. But what did you learn there that informs this narrative we're telling?
Well, so, you mentioned that I'm an art historian, and I did begin my career working in art museums in Washington, D.C. And then I realized that what I'm really interested in is estates, plantations with houses full of collections and stuff, and then all kind of different people who interact with it. So that's why I made the shift from art museums to historic sites. And what is so incredible about Renolda is that it is both. It's both a fascinating country estate created by the wife of a brilliant business tycoon in the early 20th century that was then turned into an art museum by their granddaughter in the 1960s with a magnificent collection of American art. So that was just like a rich banquet for me. So many interesting things to think about. And we were working on kind of pushing the dual identities that Renolda had at the time as an historic site and a museum, kind of pushing those together. It was an historic site and an art museum. And some of the stories of the historic site were difficult, because they involved tobacco, which is a word nobody wants to say. And it was, the heyday of Renolda as an estate was during the Jim Crow era. So there's all kind of interesting, parts of that story as well.
Well, that is interesting about tobacco, because now tobacco has become a dirty word. And yet the name for this whole area is Tobacco Road,
right.
And then as you initially said, tobacco and the success of tobacco in Virginia and by extension, the northern part of North Carolina was instrumental in making the colonies viable economically and completely dependent on slave labor.
Yes. And R.J. Reynolds himself grew up on a tobacco plantation in the southern part of Virginia in Patrick County. He was from that background, and he came to Winston-Salem in the New South, the era of the New South, and, created his company that ended up being, successful beyond what we can imagine.
R.J. Reynolds, what we all know today as
RJR, exactly.
RJR,
and it still exists today. Tobacco is incredibly important to the American story. It's complicated and difficult, but then so is everything, as I was just saying. And
it's so intertwined. It's our version of cotton. It's our version of cotton. The way cotton is for the deep South, tobacco is for the Mid-Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, so where is the current thinking? Because at one point this was all a breakthrough, even to bring it up. Mm-hmm. And then there was a backlash in many cases to the idea that you would highlight slavery at a presidential home would somehow usurp the meaning. You've addressed that, but what is the current balance? Where are we, would you say, nationally in this? It's really a movement to this whole truth history idea. Yeah,
that's definitely a process, not an event. And what I see in the future for historic plantation sites, presidential homes, all kinds of museums, art museums, science museums, natural history museums. Museums are public places, and very interesting research has shown that people trust what they learn in museums more than they trust what they read in the media or hear in the media. So we at museums have an incredible responsibility, with this public trust that we hold. Yeah. And I think that museums can become places for people to have the kind of conversations that we have to have in this country to get over some of the roadblocks and breakdowns and
the division.
Communicating. Museums can bring people together, can use collection objects, can use power of place to push forward these kinds of conversations. And I think that's going to be critically important in our future.
I like what you're saying there about the power of place. There is something that, I know in my own experience that if I saw it at Mount Vernon, I'm going to believe it about George Washington more than something I read and somebody on the internet says about George Washington. I was like, I don't know. I saw the actual teeth. Or whatever it is, right?
Oh, you can see them. They're there.
I know. That's what I've obviously been, a couple of times. And I say, you can tell, no, they were wooden. They really are. You can see them, so it's, but you see, that's tip of my mind, so to speak, and I don't know about what I read or what someone explained to me. So I think you're making a really powerful case that the education of the future, like educating the people of the future, is going to rely on things like that. People don't want to see it on the internet, and they don't necessarily trust it, you know. And so actually people have a high premium on seeing it in person or going. You know, I want to go to the thing, like almost like a pilgrimage.
Yes, and one of the things that we've done at Montpelier that's been really powerful is that as I was saying earlier, we've worked with the descendants of people who were slaves at Montpelier, and their input and their advice and their counsel has made what we do so much better and more authentic and deeper. And, you know, this kind of community input is incredibly important. And I think that museums all over the country should also be reaching out to the communities around them and asking the communities how they can better serve. Museums are no longer bastions of the elite. You know, museums are community resources, and the people who are going to be the visitors and users of those experiences, I think, must be part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Well, give me an example of a couple of the things that you learned or were able to highlight because of your engagement with the descendants of the enslaved. That's not a typical group that's consulted when deciding what to show at a presidential estate, right?
Yeah. So we had two sort of guiding lights through the process of creating the exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color. And the first one was to emphasize the humanity of their ancestors. And the reason that's the case, emphasize the humanity. So what I realize now is that some of the things that I did earlier in my career were efforts to make slavery easier to take in. We tended to make it into an abstraction, make it into an academic subject. Not really talk about it vis-a-vis human beings. But what the descendants said is, we want you to emphasize the humanity of our ancestors. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got about the exhibition that has been the most meaningful to me, someone said one time that this exhibition helped him remember that slavery happened to one person at a time. And if you'd asked me what our goal was for the project, I wouldn't have been able to say it, but that is it exactly.
Wow.
And then the second big guiding light was, do not leave slavery in the past. Because Americans feel pretty comfortable with, 1865, the war is over, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, check, let's move on. And, Americans don't want to think about what actually happened later, the failure of Reconstruction, the rebirth of white supremacy, or never went away, but it came back and was
the resurgence.
Yes, was turned into law in most of the southern states.
Yes,
and things that, and we are still climbing out of that.
Well, we've still got Wilmington and Tulsa and places like that people don't talk about.
We have a long, long way to go. And we still have systemic racism. And we have income inequality and education inequality and healthcare access inequality, not to mention, police brutality. And, there are many, many ways that we haven't moved on from the legacies of slavery.
Now, as a white person talking about this, I know I am sensitive to how that might sound. How do you feel about that, being a white debutante from Virginia, right? Saying all this stuff. How do you think about that? Because I'm not saying, of course, that you shouldn't, but what's the responsibility that you feel there?
That's an extremely important question, Doug, and it's something that I think about all the time. And I actually grew up in Georgia.
Okay.
So, even in the deeper South, I have been, I am, and I want to be an ally in pushing these stories into the forefront and having them be considered on equal footing with the stories everyone knows. And if I can do that and be a bridge to people who might otherwise have a hard time hearing it, then I want to do that. I'm privileged to be able to be a partner in this work.
Right. And so when you look forward, given the current political climate and how volatile this conversation can be these days, what do you think about the future of being able to teach what you're calling whole truth history?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important that we, as I was saying earlier, meet people where they are, so that they understand that we're not threatening to take away anything. It's an expansion. It's not a zero-sum game. It's both and. It's not either or. Both and. I'm not sure how to do that. I mean, at the school board level, at the PTA level, helping people understand that we're not taking anything away.
Well, it has to happen at the experiential level and not just the telling level. And that's where museums come in, because people can actually have an experience and actually see something that alters their thought process, because you can have a new thought process when confronted with an artifact. And I know I'm speaking to a museum curator, so you should be the one saying this, not me. But I just really get that's the hope. And in the same way that that stunning sentence, slavery happens to one person at a time, I would like to think that transformation of your perspective also happens one person at a time.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a beautiful thing. Yes.
Well, so thank you for contributing to that transformation and for standing for it in the face of everything you've had to stand in the face of.
Well, thank you, Doug. And you and the team at Doria Underwood have been a great inspiration to me always.
Well, thank you. Elizabeth Chu, who is the chief curator right now at Montpelier and has had such a big influence on the way history is presented, not only today, but in the future. Thank you for being with us on Empowering Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Empowering Leadership. If you enjoyed this episode, take a moment to subscribe for free on your favorite podcast platform. Give us a rating and a review so that other leaders like yourself can find us. Sign up for Doria Underwood's email newsletter by visiting us at doriaunderwood.com. That's it for now. Go forth and be amazing, and take good care of your people. Empowering Leadership is produced by Doria Underwood and Andy Go of Gojo Studios. Doria Underwood serves visionary companies who are serious about realizing their dreams and who are unwilling to settle for incremental results. Our clients are looking for breakthrough results and a deeper sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. To learn more, visit us at doriaunderwood.com.